Good evening, everyone. Simon Jacobson here. And we titled this class, The Siege. Does anybody feel besieged in their lives? You don't have to raise your hands. Based on, if you are a reflection of cross-section of society, then you probably feel besieged. Besieged can manifest different forms and shapes. Once upon a time, maybe not in such a free society, a siege was literally a battle and a war, but psychologically, we live in a life and we live in a world where the siege may be even worse than it is when there's actual war, because it's an assault and a battle, an assault on our psyches. They say, statistics say that by the time you're 20 years old, an average Westerner, man or woman, has seen 1 million advertisements. 1 million advertisements. And he definitely didn't make 1 million purchases. So the impact of media and all the messages that inundate us, literally every second, that overstimulate us, is a way, a siege on our psyche, on our person, on our faculties, on our attention. So in a way, the blessing of our generation, where there's called the information revolution, where there's so much information, can also be a curse when you don't have protection. So that's just a short, teaser of what the meaning of the siege is. But the real reason that I chose to speak about this topic was because tomorrow, is a significant date in the Jewish calendar. It's called Asar B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet. The Hebrew month of Tevet is the 10th, and it's a legal fast day, a Jewish legal fast day. One of four actually that the Bible mandates, not counting Yom Kippur. And they're all four associated with the destruction of the temple in one way or another, and a form of a sequence. So when you look into the Tanakh, into the Bible, it talks about how Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, besieged the city of Jerusalem with the intention of conquering it and destroying its temple. And then this was repeated almost similarly 490 years later by the Romans in the time of the Second Temple. So on the 10th of Teves, the Torah tells us, the Tanakh tells us in the book of the prophets, in the book of Jeremiah, the book of Yechezkel, a few other books, they talk about this, that Samach Melech Bavel, that the king of Babylon, on this day besieged, surrounded the city of Jerusalem. And it would take 3 years, actually, until he finally breached the walls, which would be on the 17th of Tammuz, which is another fast day. And 3 weeks after that, finally burned down the temple, which is Tisha B'Av, the saddest day of the calendar. Though the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av mark the 3 weeks that are considered the saddest part of the Jewish year, with Tisha B'Av being the saddest part of the calendar. But it all began with the besieging of Jerusalem on this day. And we still remember it. Now we're talking about almost 500 years later. And we fast. We actually deprive ourselves from eating a meal during this day, and we remember the surrounding and the besieging of Jerusalem, which of course begs the question. I mean, everything has a limit. Why would we still be grieving over something that happened literally 2,500 years ago, as if it's a problem today? And why is it so significant? It surrounded Jerusalem. We understand it was not a pleasant, was a sad part of Jewish history. But the real tragedy was, as I mentioned, was the destruction, the burning down of the temple, or the breaching of the wall. So if we remember Tisha B'Av every year, the saddest day, and we dim the lights, and we fast 24 hours actually, and we remember the destruction, why the need for another reminder? And it's not characteristic of Judaism to dwell on negative. And one of the reasons the Jewish people are still here today is because we always had the ability to spring back and to be reborn like the moon, even at the point of extinction, and to always focus on life, celebrating life, and celebrating the possibilities. And even when we face the abyss and the difficulties of life, we're always able to dig deeper and access the inner spirit and joy that allows us to survive anything. So it seems uncharacteristic to focus on these negative things. I said, even if you wanted to designate one day or 2 days, but why back to the 10th of Teves? Which brings me back this question to all the same question that can be asked about every Jewish ritual and tradition and every word, the syllable of the Torah, and that is, who cares? Remember those two words, who cares? Why is it relevant to us today in the 21st century, things that were written, that happened in a different time in history, different part of the world, geography? It's one thing, it's nice to know your history, it's nice to, nostalgia is a beautiful thing. Like some say, nostalgia is not like what it used to be. To commemorate and to remember our ancestors. But that doesn't mean necessarily it's relevant. That just means that we honor those that came before us. But to be able to connect with a passion, with a personal passion to any of these ideas requires that they be understood in a relevant way. Or else, why would we stick to remembering all these different traditions? And this, as I said, is across the board. Whether it's a questions about Passover, or Hanukkah that we just came from, or Purim, or Sukkot, or Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. And the answer to all these questions is that the Torah is not just a book of history, and we're not just commemorating the past. It is actually a blueprint for life, and its messages within every ritual, even within every fast day, has relevant messages, application to our time today. And it's not just remembering the besieging of a city back then, Jerusalem, no matter how significant that was. And even the destruction of the temple was not just remembering a destruction of some building that stood many years ago. No, because we could have rebuilt many synagogues. We've rebuilt many synagogues since in many communities. Many things to honor and celebrate. Why do we have to remember the destruction of a building? So as we shall see, and this will be the theme of this discussion, is that there's a profound psychological insight into the 10th of Tevet that is relevant to each of us and can help us literally deal with our own challenges in life. But to get there, let's begin with an important introduction, following my first introduction, following my introduction before that. It's all introduction to introduction to introduction. And that is that somewhat of a snapshot of how we define reality. Most of us, you ask, what is reality? The knee-jerk reaction is the reality that we experience. Experiential reality, empirical reality, as they call it, which is what we experience with our five senses. What you see, what you hear, what you taste, touch, and smell. Now, if someone says, is that all of reality? If a child asks you, is that all of reality? Or you're thinking to yourself. So obviously with a little thought you realize, no, that's what I consciously experience. But then there are things that, for example, like love, like pain, like ideas. All those things don't fit into the sensory tools and sensory criteria, because you can't see ideas, you can't taste, touch, or smell them, or hear them. I mean, you could hear someone communicate an idea, but an idea by definition is an ethereal entity, and so is love, and so are all of our emotions. So when it comes to anything called feelings or experiences in a way that's beyond the senses, that's also part of reality. So we have now two stages of reality. One is the surface level of reality, which we experience with our senses, and second was we'll call the suprasensory, ones that our mind and our heart experience. So though they're not as tangible and they cannot be related to in the senses. Someone says, I don't see love, that doesn't mean there's no love. It means that love has to be seen with different tools. You can't see it with your eyes. Just like we can't see microscopic particles, subatomic particles. Not because we don't have the microscopes and the tools, because it's simply beyond the scope of senses. You experience them in different ways. And so if someone asks, okay, is that reality? The answer would be, If you really think about it, well, I don't know. That's the reality I'm aware of. But for all we know, there are many, many more layers. There's subconscious, subconscious. How deep does it go? How deep down the rabbit hole can you go, as they say? So here enter the world of metaphysics, or called the world of the spirit, the world of the soul. So in Jewish mysticism, as in most schools of mysticism, they discuss that reality actually is something that none of us physically see or experience with our senses. A reality is a force of energy that's within everything that exists. And we only see the tip of the iceberg. We only experience the tip of the iceberg. But within all of existence, as we know it, there are layers and layers and layers of energy, to the point of divine energy. So just as when you look at, for instance, at a book, so there's text on the pages, there's words on the pages, but you know the words are just containers. They're containers for a message. When you look at musical notes, so the musical notes again is a language. Until somebody plays those notes, you don't realize there's a whole soul behind them. If you didn't know that these notes were called musical language, you had no clue. It just looked like gibberish. So the same way is how the mystics would describe the universe. Where you look at what you see with you experience with your five senses, is really just looking at a surface level, the outer garment of a language that you can only see the surface of, or you can only experience the surface of. But within it lies music, and within it lies a song, and within it lies power and energy that needs to be tapped. And the same, maybe the best example would be ourselves. If you ask yourself, how do you define yourself? The real you. What does the real you look like? That's not an easy answer not an easy question to answer. The real me. What do we know about ourselves? What we know about ourselves is also very much superficial about our life experiences. We know what we've seen, what we've experienced in life from the days that we have our memory, when our memory begins, whatever, 3 years old, 4 years old. Then it's fragments. Then we know our feelings about things. But then if you ask yourself, so how much more is there about yourself? Forget about whether others know them. What you know, self-awareness. How much? Do you know 5% of yourself? Do you know 10%, 100%, 20%? So I think I mentioned several times, I did a little non-scientific experiment a few years ago, where I asked a group of a few hundred people actually, of different range of backgrounds, different ages, from 10 till 90. Men and women, Jewish and not Jewish, religious and not, observant and not observant. All walks of life, believers, non-believers, and so on. And it took me some time, and the question I asked them is, if you were to give me a number, a percentage, how much do you know of yourself? Know thyself. How much do you know? Is it 1%, 2%, 5%, 50, 80, 90? Across the board, no matter what background, no matter what, it was all about age, the age of the person. Where a 10-year-old, the 10-year-olds, almost all of them answered something like, I know 80%. Once you got through them what that means, because it's not so easy to communicate, explain to a child what it means, percent of something. But, like saying, you look in this room, you could say, if I asked you, what do you know about this room? You could say, well, if you're talking about what I see with my eyes, you can see 100% of this room. If you're asking about what do you know about what kind of energy is in this room, or vibes, or how many microscopic subatomic particles are in this room, that's another story. Because that's not that, you need different tools. So the 10-year-olds, almost across the board, all said 80%, 90%. And by the time I'm 20 or 30, I'll know 100% about myself. And the 90-year-old, the oldest of the group, was the exact opposite. The older they were, the less they knew. 1%, 2%, I heard someone say, 5%. And maybe that I don't even know. And the range of ages between was all literally in that same progression. The younger the person, the more percentages they thought they knew. The older the person, the less. Which is a fascinating, it seems obvious once you hear it, but it's fascinating. It means as we grow in age and we become more aware and more intelligent, we come to the awareness, as the Rabbi Yosef Albo writes in Sefer Ikrim, Tachlis HaYediyah Shalei Neida, that the ultimate knowing is knowing that you don't know. So basically, two types of people. There are people who don't know, and there are people who don't know that they don't know. and which means they think they do know. So that's and as older someone climbs the mountain and you see the horizon, you see how much more there is, and therefore you realize how little we know about ourselves, the mystery. So when you think about reality, it's a very difficult question to answer, to say I know reality. It's actually arrogant and very presumptuous to say I know reality based on the tools. You can say, based on the tools that I have, this is what I know. That qualification, of course, changes everything. So then when you think about it, the question really is what drives reality? If we don't even know it, what defines it? So to use a simple example, you see somebody crying, hopefully for good reasons. You see tears coming out of someone's eyes. So we know from our own experience, because that's what we do, that a tear means there must be some sadness, or maybe tears of joy, but there must be some feeling that's evoking these tears. Nobody would say that first you cry and then you feel sad. It doesn't work that way. It begins with an emotion. That emotion, in some reason, affects our physical systems to the point that it will cause a tear drops liquid to actually develop in the tear ducts, to the point where tears will come out of your eyes. And the same thing when you see a smile in someone's face. It's not first that you see a certain contortion, the face turns a certain way. It's because there's a feeling of glad, of happiness within, and for some reason that shapes into a smile. And there are different theories in science why. Why? It's true that when we see a smile, we feel a certain positive feeling. When you see something sad, you don't feel so comfortable. But that's because we've been trained to see a smile and so on. But you see, even very young children, they'll smile back to you when you smile to them, and it's not just a reflex. But whatever the reason is, it's very clear that the physical expression of a smile or a tear is a effect of a cause. It's not the cause. Yet we live in a world where we're convinced that what we see and what we experience on the outer level is the cause of things. And maybe there's some type of force within. Today, because we've become comfortable with the invisible, we know it's the DNA, it's the chromosomes, it's the genes, the cells in the human being and all of life that shapes who we are. We know that it's the subatomic particles, again, invisible, microscopic, beyond the scope of any senses, that defines existence. That the building blocks of what define reality are absolutely impossible to see and hear and taste, touch, and smell. And yet we live so much of our lives, not so much, I would say all of our lives, completely stimulated by our senses. There you have the biggest battle in a certain way going on in your life. We don't feel it as a battle because we know who's won. The senses win. But if you really think about it, reality is not shaped by your senses. Your senses are only experiencing the tip of the iceberg surface level, and you think that's it. When in truth there's forces beneath the surface that are really shaping the reality that we're experiencing with our sensory tools. As soon as one becomes aware of this fact, this is called a mystical awareness. And I don't like to use the word mystical because it sounds so mystical. It sounds so mysterious. In truth, it's an awareness of a higher reality, of a reality beyond the scope of the normal day-to-day superficial life. Now, some say, okay, even if this is true, I don't have time for this. I have money to make. I have clients to deal with. I have a life to live. I have no time for this stuff. So it's true, many people don't really care about what's going on beneath the surface. Some people care very much, and they can't really, they're restless until they find out what's going on. And we're all wired differently. Some people are natural spiritualists, you can say. They naturally gravitate to understand what makes things function. And others try to survive and try to be successful. Maybe superficial, so be it. They define success by what I am able to gain and succeed in the day-to-day basis. So I'm not here to persuade or convince anyone to choose which way. Usually these things are up to how you're wired, what kind of person you are. Interestingly, God forbid, when a person experiences trauma, loss, death, any form of grief, then when their surface level is shaken up, they always go inward because it's not working. See, as long as the machine is working, you don't really care about what makes it tick. But when it's not working, that's when we suddenly so to speak, wake up and say, what's going on? And that's why some people have very strong life-changing experiences when there's a loss or when there's a trauma. Because the script that was working for them didn't work. Now, God forbid that we have to wait for trauma or a loss to experience that. The fact is we can experience it any time. And obviously the wise person, Ezu Chacham Harayas Anoilad, the wise person sees ahead, sees the birthing, looks, doesn't wait till tragedy strikes. Healthy trees are healthy before the storm strikes. But again, you can't really compel someone who thinks their life is working, and they think they know even though they don't know. But if they think their life is working, whatever they define as being working, they have a good relationship, a good marriage, children, making money, whatever it is, and they're happy with themselves, you can't really do much to shake someone up, and I don't even know if it's our role to shake someone up. So that again is something that each of us has to deal with. And it's not the point. I'm just discussing the facts, and everyone has to determine how they want to relate to them. But the fact is, at the same time, the question I asked at the outset, whether you feel besieged, I want to elaborate on that question. And that is the question about, do you feel your life is fragmented? Fragmented life. I want to define what a fragmented life means. In psychological terms, it's a life where you have many voices inside of you. And I don't mean necessarily psychosis in the literal sense of the word. You know, the joke about the difference between the psychotic neurotic and the psychiatrist. The psychotic builds castles in the air, the neurotic lives in them, the psychiatrist collects rent from both. But I mean, fragmented life is different voices, meaning even the simple argument, the simple battle that each of us deals with almost on a daily basis between your heart and your mind. Something attracts you, something seduces you, something grabs your attention, and your heart wants it. And then your mind says to you, maybe it's not such a healthy thing. Maybe it's destructive. Maybe long term it's going to leave, it has consequences. And there's the battle. Every time a telemarketer tries to manipulate your emotions to get you to buy something, you have this battle. More often than not, usually the heart wins out because impulses are impulses. Most mistakes are made because we don't really reflect. So the reflective mind and the impulsive heart are at odds with each other. They don't have to be, because there are many things that your heart may desire that is healthy. So let's say something that your heart is attracted to, and then you let your mind do the research and come back and say, you know what, it's not a bad thing, go for it. That's a healthy type of emotional experience. Now, of course, there are times of danger, God forbid, or other things where you just have to follow your impulses. There's no time to research things. I'm not talking about those situations. But general situations where somebody makes a good pitch, sells you on something, or something seduces you, something attracts you. So what a healthy person will do is allow the mind to take over and reflect on it, and not let anyone manipulate and say, listen, if you don't commit right now, you're going to lose the opportunity. You reflect on it, you sleep over it, and so on. How many mistakes would we avoid in our lives if, when someone provoked you, or something affected you, something seduced you, instead of you grabbing the moment and acting, instant gratification, you just stepped on it and you thought about it for a day? How many things would we have not done? Because once you get beyond the moment of passion, you think about it. If it's really good for you, you can always come back to it tomorrow. Again, I'm not talking about the dangerous situations where you have to follow your impulses and so on. So we have fragmentation all over the place in our lives if we really want to start analyzing it. And again, most of us don't look at it until there's a problem. Let's say when your relationships don't work. You're trying to find a shidduch, a match. It's not working. Or there's a loss in your life. Or a relationship ends. Or you lose a job. Or there's or some other thing. That's when we start seeing the cracks in our lives. When things are going well, at least on the surface level, we usually avoid digging deeper. It's an interesting irony, but that's how it is. So there's a lot of fragmentation inside of us, different voices. You see people all the time. I see it. People, there's one face and one personality they are at work. And there's another personality they are at home. And sometimes you can't even tell it's the same person. You can't tell it's the same person. At work they could be a shark, merciless, almost like no heart, heartless. And at home they're like a lamb, the same person. Unfortunately, there's some people that bring their work personality to their homes. And then there's different personalities in different situations. As they say, different faces and masks we wear to accommodate. Are you the same way when you're alone at home or alone in the shower than when you go to a party and you have to make an impression? And then you start wondering how much of you is really being shaped by peer pressure and by social pressure, and how much of how much is really you. When we're born, we are considered to be seamless identities. Children don't look in the mirror before they go out, and they don't not self-conscious about themselves. They don't decide, it's not really etiquette to start crying right now. Newborn children cry when they're hungry, and when they're tired, or when they're needy. At the same time, children also don't lie. What you see is what you get. There's no duplicity. It's as we grow into, when we first see duplicity in our lives, our parents or others, that's when we begin to duplicate duplicity. We begin to emulate those around us. We begin to see it as an option. So we turn into what they call echad b'peh, echad b'lev. You say one thing, you feel another. You can smile to someone, and someone can smile to you, and they can then stab you in the back. This type of duplicity a child doesn't have. So a child is a seamless. There's one voice. But as we grow into adults, we start having many voices, many interests. To some point, you can even start wondering whether you've been shaped by your society. You don't even know who the real you is anymore. Is it you, or is it the one that people expected of you? And can you even analyze it? We grow up in our parents' homes. Our parents have expectations of us. They have attitudes. Even if they're healthy parents, we as children are very impressionable, and expectations have an impact on you. Especially if they're not healthy, the parents, and they impose themselves. How much of who we are today, once we left our parents' homes, is still shaped by what our parents expected of us? Not wanting to disappoint, pleasing. All the different descriptions. You have pleasers, you have enablers, you have codependents. Everyone today is familiar with all these titles. And you do these personality tests, and you end up finding out that you're codependent, pleaser, obsessive, compulsive with a little ADHD or something. We have a lot of names and numbers for different personalities. But the bottom line is, with all these tests, we know very little about who you would be had you been left alone. If you were not shaped. That's of course an impossibility, because there's no such thing. Even if parents make this active, deliberate decision, we're not going to intervene in our child's life, the child is impressionable. The child will learn something from the street then, or from a television, or from friends. There's no such thing as a clean slate. We all will be affected and impacted by the world around us. So then, I'm painting a picture that can be a portrait that sounds very depressing, but at the same time, however, we also have a sense of self. And if we did have healthier parents who gave us confidence in ourselves, they nurtured us, and there was unconditional love, you grow up and you're able to have some barometer. Of course, the worst scenario is a child growing up in a home where you constantly second guess yourself, you don't trust yourself, you don't trust your tools, and that means that anything that comes your way, you're not sure. Like the guy that says that I used to be indecisive, now I'm not so sure. So there's that element. But if, let's say, growing up in a healthier home, what happens is there's a nurturing of your psyche, of your spirit, of your soul. So yes, it's true that there are many influences and demands on you. It's not always easy to not give in, to succumb. But you have a healthy sense of self. And with that, you navigate. And nobody's perfect, And we have the tools. From a Jewish perspective, as the Bible says right in the beginning, the Torah says, Nivra Adam b'tzalmenu kidmusenu, a human being was created in the divine image. Which means you have a divine power. And by divine, it simply means that you have a certain power from the Creator. Which means that you're not shaped by the creation and by the nature of creation. You have something that can transcend your peers, society, the natural scheme of things. Animals don't have that. Animals follow the script, the divine script, to a T. And that's the way it should be. That's what keeps the balance in the universe. Like a clock. The sun will rise, predictable. So the moon will rise. The animal kingdom, the vegetable, the mineral. The entire universe works in a symbiotic fashion, symmetry. Human being can either elevate or destroy. And we can defy our own natures. We can control it to some extent. I mean, there are psychologists, especially secular psychology, which is in contrast to Jewish psychology, Torah psychology, will say that we're just like the leopard that can't change its spots. We can't change our nature. Yeah, we can fake it for a while, and we can masquerade, and we can exercise certain self-control. But push comes to shove, we're just like a beast in the wild. And they prove it with all kinds of proofs. You see people put them under certain circumstances where they're hunger or torture, and they'll behave in the most cruel way to others. But that has to be qualified. You also see human beings in the worst circumstances that did not succumb and behaved nobly. Yes, there were people in the Holocaust that were horrible to no other to protect themselves, save themselves. People that get stuck in an avalanche or in some place where there's no food, sometimes turn on each other, even to the point of cannibalism. Normal people who would never dream that they're capable of that. And there are people who are not that way. The Torah psychology says that you have the divine image within you. It's not the id, but the yid that drives a human being. It's the divine spark, the pintala spark. And that gives you a ability to transcend nature. Does it mean completely transcend? Of course not. We have to eat, we have to sleep, we need people, we want acceptance. Doesn't mean we're not impacted by peer pressure and by social pressure. But it doesn't mean you're not a slave to it if you don't want to be. In other words, it's not predestined. You have the power to defy, to transcend. Mordechai would not bow to Haman. Everyone else did. It would have been easier to bow, because everyone else was doing it. It was popular. Wouldn't have to go through any persecution. But he had a higher voice. He had a higher calling, and he would not succumb to the peer pressure. The classic example of an individual, a nonconformist. And Abraham was the same way. And Jews throughout history were that way. And that's why for some that's why some say that's why they were hated. They refused to be part of the game, the party. Not in all cases, but that's a personality feature that you find throughout, from Abraham, Moses, and so on. They were pioneers. And like a true leader doesn't look at where everybody's going. They forge their own path, and they don't look over their shoulder to see if anyone's following either. They forge it, and that's what a pioneer is about. So, just as a footnote, obviously we all wonder where those pioneers went. Why is Judaism so parochial and so conformist today? That you'll have to listen to another class, which I've discussed this topic many times. But not to digress, to go back to the theme. So we have a lot of fragmentation within us. And the older we grow, the more that fragmentation develops. Because we have so many things to satisfy. Here we are, as I said, at work, we're at home, at play, different people, you have different faces. This one you have to maneuver, here you have to manipulate, Certain people we trust, certain people we don't trust. We meet new people, we always have our defense mechanisms up. So we have a whole arsenal, sophisticated arsenal, many tools. And it forces us to end up being very fragmented. We have all these different pieces inside of us. It's rare to find that person that has inner peace and is just able to be consistent and seamless and innocent. It's almost impossible in our society. And then add into the equation what I mentioned earlier, the siege, where you were inundated, literally inundated by media, by marketing, by advertising, by internet. Whatever form or shape it takes, we all are affected by it. You're going to walk out of here, just walk down the street, there's all kinds of messages being streamed into your consciousness. And then you add that, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, the average person sits in front of a tube, whether it's a television or it's a internet. That means something outside of you is stimulating. And I'm not saying it's all bad, it's information. But you have to start wondering, what is it doing to your consciousness? And is there one thread that connects all of what you're doing? If you were to list everything you did today, a piece of paper, and you could test it, try it out. I've tested it. I mean everything, from the moment you woke up, the moment you go to sleep, you come up with around 120, 150 items. From you wake up, whatever the regimen is, you press the snooze button a few times, you exercise, you get dressed, you shower, you get dressed, I should say. Some people shower after they get dressed. I don't think so. Doesn't really matter. you brush your teeth, you tie your shoelaces, coffee, tea, breakfast. Yeah, the order is really not irrelevant here. You commute, go to work, or if you take off. Then you have your coffee break and your lunch break, and you have maybe a few important meetings, and maybe a few insignificant ones. You have your run-ins. And maybe we got our day, and literally it's a bunch of details. Maybe one or two significant things, maybe not. And then the end of the day, we will have our evenings and how we spend our evenings. And this is really, and my point here is not the detail, just the fact is it's a bunch of details. Now try, once you make this list, take a pencil or pen and try to make a line, a thread of anything that's connected with each other. You'll find that very few things are connected. Like tying your shoelaces in the morning has really very little to do with your lunch break, if at all. Or your meetings, you commute because there's no other way to get to work. But it's a bunch of details that are disconnected, disjointed forces in your life. Now you say, okay, what's the big thing? So what? What's wrong with having a bunch of details? But now let's think of this. Day after day, these fragments accumulate. Week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, millennium after millennium. We all were born in the previous millennium, right? Would that be an accurate statement? Without exposing any age. 12 years into the new millennium. And what you end up having is millions and millions of fragments. Okay, you could say, so what? Well, I'll tell you what, so what. Human beings abhor fragmentation. By nature, we cannot stand scattered things. Even though people who call themselves, even people who are technically disorganized, they still have their own organization. They have their own element of organization. And I think I mentioned this once, a guy whose desk is always filled with papers almost to the ceiling. You walk in, you say, how does this guy can manage anything? He's a very efficient guy. And ask him, how do you find anything? And he says, tell me something you're looking for. So I mentioned something. He says, here, right here. And he pulls it out like from the bottom of the pile. And if somebody tries to clean up his desk or something, he'll go crazy. So in his own mind, he has this organization. Or they say that if a cluttered desk is a sign of a cluttered mind, what's an empty desk a sign of, right? So, we all by nature need organization. There's no such thing as, when we don't have it, chaos is disturbing to us. Even young children, show them objects of different shapes and forms, and you'll see that without education, they will naturally put a circle inside of a hole, a square inside of a square, a rectangle, and so on and so forth. Because we naturally look to make order. So fragmentation, by definition, is a disturbing factor. And you could even argue that anxiety, and again, this is not a scientific conclusion, but I'm sure that this is the case, anxiety, the rate of anxiety, the height of anxiety is directly linked to how much fragmentation you have in your life. Because when there's all these things pulling at you, you may not be aware of so much fragments, but they're all there. It has to create restlessness. It has to create like some type of disturbance. It's like walking into your room, and someone turned over the whole place, and you have no idea what's what. The difference, however, is fragmentation is not visible. It's in your psyche. It's in your memory. It's in your mind. It's in your heart. But think of the times when you really have a conflict where, you did something really terrible and you're carrying a horrible secret. Very disturbing. Why? Because it's like you have it inside of you. You're talking to people that you love or care, and you can't tell them. This creates, it's not just guilt. It creates like two forces where you're living with a terrible awareness that others don't know. Just using one example. Now imagine with thousands of little secrets like that. They end up affecting our psyche. Now, as I said, young newborn children don't have this. They don't have it, not because they're not sophisticated thinkers, because they haven't yet experienced duplicity. They haven't experienced the fragmentation and the complexity of so many different things tugging at us in every possible direction. So the question is then, of course, what does one do about it? And where do you go with that? Which leads me to the classic formula in Jewish thinking is called Yediyas Hamach L'Chetzi Refuah. Awareness of a problem is half the cure. It's important to identify the problem and the root of the problem. If you trace the roots, where does fragmentation come from? If young children don't have it, At what point do we suddenly develop it? At what point does it begin to manifest in our lives? And by retracing it to the roots, we can begin to appreciate and understand the issue at hand. And this brings me back to the relevance of this day called Asar B'Tevis. You'll see its relevance here. So the story goes, as I mentioned, 3 stages. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, first besieges, surrounds Jerusalem. A few years later, 3 years later, he finally breaches the wall, which is on the 17th of Tammuz. Some say the 9th of Tammuz, but there's an opinion 17th of Tammuz, which is when we fast. The same day that the Romans breached the wall. 490 years later, the second temple. And the third stage is when he actually burns down the temple. Now the relevance in our lives of all these 3 stages by understanding why is it significant to remember 2,500 years later this tragedy. Yes, the temple was the holiest place on earth. Temple Mount, till this day, it's the holiest place on earth. When Jacob fell asleep there, he woke up disturbed that he fell asleep in this holy place and didn't know what it was. He called it the gate to heaven. So the holiest place. The temple was the holiest building. The high priest, the priests, the service there represented the epitome of connecting with the divine. And then it was destroyed. So no question it was a major tragedy. But why are we still remembering it thousands of years later? Yecheskel, the prophet, was consoled by God when he said, how are we ever going to make up for this temple? He said, Ve'eyela migdash ma'at, build mini sanctuaries. And hence that's why we build synagogues, and we build Beis Medrash, Beis Knesset or Beis Medrash, a place where we gather. It's like a mini sanctuary, it's a mini temple. But obviously it doesn't come to the original. And we still remember it as if it's happened yesterday. On Tisha B'Av, literally, we sit on low stools, we darken the lights, like we're sitting Shiva, we're sitting, God forbid, the loss of a parent. That's the way we behave. We fast. It's even more than the loss. In Shiva, you don't fast. You don't have to fast. On the contrary. Because the temple was not just a building. It represented the gate, as I said, to heaven in each of us, the bridge between heaven and earth. And when that was destroyed, there was a window closed. Not entirely, but it was a serious shift in consciousness. So each of us, as I mentioned before, when you define what reality is, remember I spoke about reality, we have an outer reality and we have an inner reality. And imagine the door closes between these two realities. William Blake wrote that if you cleanse the doors of perception, everything would be the way it really is, infinite. And poets and thinkers and mystics and prophets and anyone that really thinks about it realizes at some point that the reality that we experience here is a very small little tip of the iceberg compared to the bigger picture. And I always mention this as a good example when people ask the question, where does the soul go to after death? Now most of us ask the question, hopefully it's an academic one, but it of course has much more meaning to someone that actually has to deal with that tragedy. Where does the soul go to after death? The question itself is based on a false assumption, and even an arrogant assumption. And that is that we are where it's at, so we're asking, where does the soul go to after death? As if, here's where it's at, what else is there? But think of the imaginary conversation between electricity and a refrigerator. So the refrigerator, the appliance, asks the electricity, where do you go to when they pull the plug? And the electricity is incredulous and angry, says to the refrigerator, what kind of chutzpah, what kind of nerve to ask such a question? Where'd you come from? They just invented you 100 or 200 years ago, this little box. They figured out how to generate some of me into you, and you refrigerate food, and you think now you're like the center of the universe, and you ask me where I go? I was always around. I go back to my natural habitat, which is beyond time and space as you know it. And when I wasn't confined in this little box called you. But a refrigerator cannot see outside the box. It only understands this box. So from its perspective, hey, there's nothing more. And then the question is, where does the soul go to? So the mere assumption that we are where it's at, and that's all of reality is based on what we experience, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that's somewhat arrogant. We live our lives that way. That's for sure. We live our lives that way because this is what we have, and we make the best of it. And as I said earlier, most of us don't think about what's behind the curtain. Some people do. And as I said, when we suffer with anguish or other anxiety, we suddenly think about it. There's a crack. As Leonard Cohen says, the cracks, in order to allow the light to get through. There's no crack. You don't know there's light that gets through. Moment when a child is born, at a moment, God forbid, the other extreme, when there's death, those few moments, a door opens up. I remember the first time I actually went to a funeral. It was a grandmother. And it was like really one of those Edgar Allan Poe days, perfect for a funeral, stormy, sleety, in New York. And it was the first time I saw an open grave. And then a few weeks later, my son was born. Not to compare the two, but I had that image in my mind that the door opens twice in our lives. Once when you're born, and once when the soul, when the body is put back into earth. And then we go back to regular life. The curtain closes. But when you think about it, there is another reality. And as such, there's a disconnect between these two realities. The temple was a door that opened up, that allowed you to see the deeper reality and experience it and connect to it. Allowed you to kiss, heaven and earth to kiss. Shara Shamayim, in the words of Jacob, and many different expressions. And that's why the destruction of the temple was not just some type of one-time tragedy, and now we move on. It happens every moment. To the point where the Talmud says that a generation doesn't rebuild the temple, it's as if they destroyed the temple. What kind of statement is that? Well, we weren't around 2,500 years ago. We were not the ones that were sinas chinam by the second temple, or the other sins that caused the destruction. We're new, but we just came around and we're now here. Why are we responsible? And it's considered, if we don't rebuild it, as if we destroyed it. Because it's not just about the temple, it's about the connection between heaven and earth. And that is a perpetual effect that remains till this day. That to access higher reality, to access the divine, takes a lot of work. It's very difficult. And with the temple it would have been a lot easier, because there was a channel open. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's harder. And we grieve for that. Not to grieve just to sit in the negative. The grief is meant to be a motivation to reconnect, to rebuild in our own lives. So when we in some way build a temple of our homes, of our work, of our activities, you spiritualize your material life, you're building a small temple. Which explains what the Shalah says about the temple. There's everything has a mission statement. The mission of life, in 2 words, maybe the shortest mission statement ever stated, is God says, "Va'asili migdash v'shachanti b'seicham." Build for me a sanctuary, a holy place, migdash, like Kodesh, a place of kedusha, a house of holiness. V'shachanti b'seicham, and I will rest among you. So the Shalah, the great mystic, the 16th century mystic, asks, Rabbi Yitzchak Horowitz asks, it should say v'shachanti b'seichai. In Hebrew, when you say also the migdash, build for me a building, a structure, a sanctuary, the end of the sentence is, and I will rest in it. If I said build for me a sanctuary, I will rest among them. A sanctuary is not a them, it's not people, it's not a plural, it's an individual building. So why does the sentence say I will rest among them? And his answer is because the whole purpose of the temple was not a divine dwelling in bricks and mortar and wood and objects. It was in order for God to rest within our hearts and souls. And the temple, therefore, is a microcosm, as many of the commentaries explain. Rabbeinu Bachai and many others explain that the temple was structured like the human body. The human body is made up of 3 sections: a head, a torso, a chest, and legs. So the temple had a Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies, where the head rested, the Holy Ark, the Torah, the mind, the central nervous system. There's the chest that has right, left, and center. So you have a right arm, left arm, and a heart. Where the 3 in Kodesh, in the Holy, there were 3 vessels. There was the menorah to the left, the shulchan to the right. Menorah was the candelabra, the what's the word for menorah? Yeah. There was the shulchan was a table where they offered loaves of bread, and the center was a altar, the internal one, the altar of incense. Mizbeach HaKteris it's called, like the heart. And then the outside was the oil mayid, was the outer level. The Azara was the outer level where you had the outer temple, the outer altar. that sublimated the animal spirit. And that's where offerings were brought, representing the outer dimension of our experience, where we interact with the raw material, untamed world, and we try to elevate it. So, I once did a series of classes on this whole structure of the temple, how it reflects in our lives. So when this temple was destroyed, what was not destroyed was not just a building; it was a door closed. The access to be able to create v'shachanti b'seicham, the ability to build the divine within, discover the divine within ourselves. So yes, it's harder today, but it's more purposeful, because today it comes with our efforts. And there are 3 stages of how this temple was destroyed, and you'll see there are 3 stages how we rebuild it. Stage number 1 is when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, surrounded the city. Stage number 2 is when he breached the wall, and stage number 3 is when he burned it down. So the burning down is Tisha B'Av. That's obviously the saddest day, because that's when the real effect took place. But nothing begins. No one gets lost overnight. When you wander, you're lost wandering somewhere. You don't start wandering. It's like someone gets lost in the woods. It didn't happen suddenly. You took one small little turn off, and then you didn't get back on, and you keep going, and then suddenly you're lost. That's why I said earlier, if you want to heal from a problem, you have to get to the root of the problem. Very often we get so consumed with the symptoms, and that becomes an end in itself when we realize it's just a symptom. Now, I'm not suggesting symptoms are not to be ignored, but symptoms are just symptoms. They're not the root. Often, the biggest problems are when you don't nip it in the bud, and then it grows into a monster. And at that point now, it's very hard to deal with because it's now out of control. For example, any lie a person tells. At the moment of a lie, a white lie, it may be inaccurate, not so seemingly terrible. But little lies build the bigger lies, and bigger lies build bigger ones. And at some point, this becomes something that is uncontrollable. So any type of damage, any type of dysfunctionality, always has a root. And in the root, you'll find it's probably much more subtle than it is when it's full blown. And if you're able to nip it in the bud, then you would solve a lot of problems. Like for example, they say when it comes to abuse. So there's this very strong expression. It says the silence was worse than the rape. That when somebody is violated in any way, someone who's hurt, especially a child, and they're not allowed to cry, they're told nothing happened, we don't cry, etc., etc. That silence, that invalidation of not allowing someone to express their feelings, their painful feelings, is worse than the original crime in many ways. Because we all will experience in life some disappointments. But if you could trust yourself and say, you know what, I don't like this, and I'm going to cry out, and I will not be silent, so at least you have the beginning of the healing. But if you're told you can't even trust, you can't even rely on, you can't even validate your feelings of being violated or being hurt, nothing happened, then you begin to distrust your tools altogether, and you don't even have any way out of this. Which is why in healing and therapy, especially serious abuse, one of the first and most important things what they call breaking the silence. Breaking the silence. That's one of the hardest things to do, but one of the critical juncture that is necessary to open up. Or people, for example, who have participated in 12-step programs. So the first time a person goes, who's been, let's say, suffering from some addiction or any other problem, so it's very, very uncomfortable. First of all, to acknowledge that you're addicted, to acknowledge that you're not in control. And in the beginning, it's difficult to speak, but then you start seeing people have courage, and they're able to speak, and it's like it blows you away. How could the person just speaks about their vulnerabilities, about their weaknesses, pride and other reasons we keep everything secretive. And then you realize at some point that breaking the silence allows the toxins out of you. It's very similar to what happens to an infection. If it doesn't have fresh air, it begins to fester, it begins to grow, and then it can become a disease that, God forbid, nobody wants to know of. It's critical. Fresh air to an infection is exactly what breaking the silence is to any type of hurt. The ability that you have the right that you have the dignity to be able to say, I was hurt. And no one should be able to silence you and tell you, no, you're wrong, it didn't happen, it's your fault, or whatever, minimizing it, etc., etc. So breaking the silence is basically awareness of an issue. And once you're aware of it, you're halfway to the cure. It doesn't mean it's the cure, but without that, forget about it, because you're in denial. You don't even know there's a problem. You deny the problem, you minimize it, and so on. So this brings me back to the idea, the destruction of the temple, or the destruction of our own dignity, of our own inner self, the fragmentation, the destruction rather, doesn't begin in a vacuum. It began because before that, there was the breaching of the wall. That's the fragmentation. And before the fragmentation came the besieging of the wall. The siege on Jerusalem. So what are the three things in our psychological lives? You don't have to wait for something to be destroyed to realize there's a problem. The root of it all begins with Asara B'Tevis. The root of it all begins when there's a siege on you, when you are surrounded or inundated. At that moment, your city can be intact, your temple can be intact, but it's the beginning of the problem. And that's when you want to resolve the issues. You don't want to wait till your walls are breached. And you definitely don't want to wait till the building is burned. So in psychological terms, a siege is any form of something imposing itself upon you. Think of technically what it is. Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army surrounded this holy city called Jerusalem, the walled city. A siege is essentially an assault on your inner city. And it can take on the shape of many shapes and forms, especially in case of children who are really defenseless. They're not entirely defenseless. Everybody has their wall, everyone has their protection. But in the case of children, so when they in some way are hurt or abused, that's a siege. They're besieged. They're surrounded. In our own case as adults, a siege can take on the shape of any form where there's pressure. Some people putting demands on you, people in some way attacking you. Like I recently was speaking to someone, I think I mentioned this once here, someone who was very successful in the financial world. And then when the recession hit in 2008 and so on, he had his wake-up call. And he told me, with tears in his eyes actually, that he cannot tell me how many people he betrayed, how many friends, because as he said, the pressure to grow and to climb the ladder, be successful, really is a demand on you to essentially betray everyone around you. To not be completely truthful, to be very aggressive, not always be honest. And he talked even about co-workers, because they're all competing. And he says, and our bosses set it up in a way where they want us to compete against each other because they want the bottom line. He said, my humanity was taken away from me. And I didn't even know it. It was all in the name of success. That's an example of a siege. Now, I asked him, of course, I said, and if someone had come to you a year ago when you were right in the middle of all that, and you were like on the top of the mountain, and said to you, what are you doing? He says, I wouldn't be able to hear. I was minimizing it. I would say the name of success. I'll help people with the money I make, etc., etc. This is, of course, the problem, because when things are going well, we don't recognize that we're under attack. But each of us right here is under attack. Don't kid yourself. Because there are people who want things of us. There are people who are marketing things to us. That doesn't mean, and I'm not suggesting any type of fire and brimstone attitude against marketing and advertising and so on. I'm sure it has plenty of virtues. But it's definitely an assault. Everybody wants something of you. And they will find it one way. And the smartest ones package it in such a way that you can't even tell. It's completely subliminal. I've never researched it. But they say when you go into places, real sophisticated supermarkets or stores or mega stores, so everything from the position of where products are placed, the colors, the level of oxygen being pumped into there. That we know in Las Vegas is definitely a factor, and definitely there are no clocks there. And I went to check it out. So everything, the colors, the music, and they say even things that are subliminal that your naked eye won't catch. Send messages. Now, some of it you could say, okay, big thing. But remember, if it's once in your lifetime, it's one thing. But if it's constant, it's forever, that means it is taking over your senses. So of course you're going to be blinded to deeper reality. I mean, has anyone made a study of, for example, our exposure to hyperstimulation of our senses? How could you really be that sensitive to have a loving relationship with someone when you're so stimulated by so many other things? So we convince ourselves, listen, we can juggle it all. It's called multitasking. Yeah, but they're antithetical to each other. Outer stimulation is a direct contradiction to inner stimulation. To sit with someone who you love and not look at your BlackBerry or iPhone or so on is not easy today. And we don't make so much of it because we say, hey, listen, it's part of the world. I still love you, you know. But really having a conversation with someone you love really means complete focus on that thing. Are we able to do that today? You know, so one guy said to me, I don't know if I'm able to, but I don't know if I do it, but I'm able to do it. So I said, yeah, why don't you try it out? You know, it's like we convince ourselves we're capable of many things, but then when it comes to trying, it doesn't really work because we're so addicted to our habits. So we live in a world that there is a siege going on. And it is subtle. And I'm not even trying to talk about it necessarily in a negative way, it's about awareness. It's about awareness. People are able to focus on one thing for a long period of time. It's not so easy to find. Yes, if there's self-interest involved, and there's a lot of motivation, maybe we can do it because there's a narcissistic gain involved. But it's not something that's so common. You know, I've mentioned this many times. The work I did that I could say shaped and changed my life for many years. I was a younger man. I was what they called a chayzer, a maniach of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which meant that for hours, these dense and complicated talks on Shabbos and holidays, where there were no tape recorders and no notes were taken, we had to actually remember all these hours of talks and then recreate it and reconstruct it on paper. And trust me, it was not easy to do. But it trained me into another way of thinking, which is to be able to listen to someone speak for hours and absolutely no distraction. The level of concentration, of complete focus, and shutting off everything outside is, in my opinion, if this was done, I would make it absolutely a necessity in every schooling and education of our children. Because what it does, it teaches you the capacity to go into places with your mind that most of us don't go yet. You know, many people are born with very good minds. And usually they don't work hard because they get away with just getting things. And the fact is, however, real concentration, the effort that it takes to be able to focus like that is something we're not trained into doing. On the contrary, we're trained, multitasking is like considered a big virtue. You know, they tell the difference between a man and a woman, they say, is how they both prepare a scrambled egg. Okay? So this is how it goes. You know, a woman's preparing a scrambled egg in the kitchen. On one hand, she's holding a phone. On the other, she's a paper taking notes. The egg, she's making the egg. Someone rings the bell. She runs to the bell. You know, she's able to pull out things from the cupboard and so on. Someone comes in and says something. She's able to deal with it. A man, he locks the doors. If the phone rings, his egg gets spoiled. He's unable to do anything except the egg, and even that barely. You know, they have this classic case study. Now, I know this sounds sexist, but since I'm a man, I could talk about it because I'm talking obviously for the virtues of women. And that's a classic study of real multitasking. The fact of the matter is that it's very difficult in this world that we live in because there is a siege in us to really find yourself. Because how often do you have the experience of silence? The experience of everything shutting down. Imagine closing your eyes, your ears, your taste, touch, and smell. What would you be left with? So initially the thought can be frightening, terrifying. You disappear. But you won't disappear. Because you don't need eyes to see yourself. You don't need ears to hear yourself. You don't need taste, touch, and smell to experience yourself. These tools, these senses, are only really bridges and interfaces between you and the world around you. With eyes you see others. With ears we hear each other. The same with taste, touch, and smell. Yet, as I mentioned, our whole entire day is consumed with these senses. Our dreams, what do we dream about? As the Talmud says, you dream by night what you think about by day. Day is a sensory experience, so you think about sensory things. If you would spend a day with your senses at least minimized, you have completely different dreams. You would dream about ethereal things, about spiritual things, about deeper truths. But they're very hard to access when we are inundated. They had that, who did this test? It was in Washington train station, the major train station there, where a guy with a, that like $1 million violin called the Stradivarius, right? Stradivarius. So one of these, I think it was called the Bell experiment because his name was Bell. He was a great violinist, and he was sat down in very unobtrusive, in a very without any airs about him, in a train station, rush hour, playing on this Stradivarius violin, some of the most beautiful music that it would cost thousands of dollars to go hear him in a concert hall. Everybody, it's been videotaped. Everybody walked by, completely oblivious, ignoring him. The only ones that noticed him were children. A few children stopped, and there's even a video of it that the child stops. The parents schlepped the child away. The child wanted to stand because the children sensed something. Just to show you, but if they advertise it and all your friends were going, and it's a sign of prestige and status, you'd pay who knows how much and say, wow, unbelievable playing. But when it's happening in a place where, you're in the middle of your rush hour and nobody's noticing, the question is, how many other things are we missing in life? So when the Zohar says that each of us has a melody, our soul has a song. And that song is desperately trying to express itself. And it sings, but none of us hear it. Why not? Because we have extracurricular sounds that drown it out. If someone's playing a beautiful violin in the street in the middle of the rush hour, you wouldn't hear it. Not because it's not there, because the sounds are so loud, other sounds. How many sounds do we have in our lives that are drowning out the reality within? So that's why it all begins with Hasara B'Tevis, because that's when the siege begins. You don't have to wait for the building to burn down or to be breached. As soon as there's a siege, you can rest assured that if you don't do anything, the next step will be fragmentation. Because that siege will ultimately break down your defenses and will ultimately penetrate and violate you and your psyche and your soul. And then comes the third, which is of course the worst stage, when it actually takes over and burns down a part of you. Now, even after Tisha B'Av, we still have hope. There's always the rebuilding, but obviously it's a lot harder to rebuild when something's burned down than when you stop it before the breach. Or harder to heal it after the breach before it burns down. And even easier if you do it when there's the siege before there's the breach. So fragmentation in a child's life begins at the point where there's a siege. The child is exposed to all kinds of things in life and doesn't necessarily have a strong fortitude, a strong fortified inner soul. So that siege is going to ultimately create fragmentation. The child will see different things, attracted to different things, and so on. There was once a writer came to the Rabbi and said to him, I look at some of your students and I see in their eyes as naivete. They're naive. They don't know the ways of the world. They're like it. And the Rebbe responded to him, I thought an unbelievable answer. He said to him, it's not naivete. It's what you're seeing is a seamless life. They don't have two worlds. So yeah, you could look at naivete, being naive is considered usually an insult. But a child's naivete is actually a compliment. If a child wasn't naive, it wouldn't be very healthy that you're born not naive. Yes, later in life you have to be realistic and see certain things. But actually, it's beautiful to see an older person who maintains a certain naivete. Not ignorance and stupidity and being taken advantage of, but they have a seamlessness about them. They maintain an integrity. They maintain a certain sparkle, the connection, and they have not become split into 50 different parts or more. Children have that naturally. It doesn't come with effort. Because they're born, a soul is a pure environment. A soul does not know of duplicity. The soul enters into a body. The body enters into the universe. It begins to see different things. That's when it begins to be influenced by the many different voices and many different forces tugging at it. Which is why in Jewish thought and in Jewish tradition, you do whatever you can to preserve the insulation of a child. Because there'll be plenty of time, plenty of years where the child will be exposed to the larger world. So 9, think of it this way, and this is how the mystics explain, a beautiful idea. Before we enter this world, we spend 9 months in our mother's womb. So the question is asked, medicine and biology has its reasons. But in Torah we could also ask the question why God made it that way. Why didn't He even just make it, why don't we just pop out? Conception, next thing you're born. There are animals where the gestation period is much shorter. Why 9 months? And they explain because to acclimate, to prepare the soul to enter into a harsh, cruel world, to prepare a integrated, seamless, unified soul to enter into a fragmented and duplicitous world requires a lot of preparation. So the 9 months in pregnancy is like an intermediary stage where it's already a soul in a body, but it's not yet out in the outside world. So it's surrounded by and it's immersed in the embryonic fluids, in water, like in a mikveh. So, for instance, the Torah says that when the world was created, the universe, it was also mayim b'mayim, it was all covered in water, and then then the land emerged. Fish and water have a certain purity to them because they're immersed in their source. They know their source. They're connected. So a child, before coming into the harsh world where it becomes disconnected and fragmented, you let it spend 9 months still connected. But it's already a physical entity that still connects. And then it emerges, and that's birth. And in the early years of a child's life, it also doesn't happen, so a child suddenly has to go to work after a month. Done. Like you find in the animal kingdom, you do find animals after a very short period of time, even very early on, some other distant time go. And that animal kingdom, it works for those creatures. A child, early years, they're not in the womb anymore, but a child is completely surrounded and protected by its parents. And therefore in Judaism you find the traditions of even how a woman is pregnant, how she behaves. How husband and wife conceive of a child, sexuality, the concept of the mikveh. When a child is born, to surround the child with holy words. The early years of the child, to protect the child as much as possible from the harshness of the world around it, not just physically, also spiritually. Because what you want to do is fortify the soul before it has to deal with that fragmentation, which it will inevitably enter. And the pure that education is al-taras HaKodesh of a child, the more power that child will have, the more tools it will have in its arsenal to deal with the challenges of the world around it. The siege of a child begins too early, you leave the child exposed and it becomes more difficult. Which is why, of course, the healthiest of all situations is protecting our children. There's no greater responsibility. Because what you're doing then is allowing adults to grow into adults that will be able to not only not be overwhelmed by the world around them, not become part of the problem, but be part of the solution. Now, of course, I'm talking here not to children. Well, we all have our inner child, but we're all adults at this point. The point is that Asar B'Tevis teaches us that wherever you are in your life, you can begin then. You don't have to, can't go back, can't turn the clock back, no matter what kind of childhood you had. You can begin now by understanding that there is a siege and you have to do things to protect your city. Your city. The city is your soul, your body, your being. And you do it very similar to the topic I once discussed, where the Baal Shem Tov says when it comes to the great flood. So Noah was told, "Aseh lecha teva," build yourself an ark. So the Baal Shem Tov says, teva also means words. In Hebrew, teva, letters, words. Teva is a word. That surround yourself with holy words of Torah and prayer, that becomes your ark that allows you to float on the raging floodwaters, which include daigas haparnasa, all the worries and anxieties of this life, financial ones included. So we all need to be able to surround ourselves with a wall, not insulate ourselves to the point we can't interact with the world around us, but like the wall around Jerusalem is a wall, but it has gates. There's the Jaffa gate, there's this gate, there's that gate. Which means you monitor what enters, what doesn't enter into your life. As the Sifsei Koyen, the Shachan, the Torah says, on the chapter, Sheftim v'sheftim titnu lecha b'chol sharecha, appoint judges and law enforcers at all your gates. He says, what are the gates? He says 7 gates. The gates are your senses: 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, and a mouth. Appoint guards to watch what enters into your world and what goes out. So we have a wall around us. Even on a very physical level, what protects us from infection is because we don't just have our internal organs are surrounded. They're surrounded by a skeleton, which is surrounded by layers of skin until the outer layer, the epidermis, that is covered by hair, and that basically protects anything from entering the body. Now, when something does enter, the body has its own mechanisms to protect itself. So we too have a very physical sense of the word. We have our internal organs are surrounded by a wall. The wall is our skin and bones, our flesh and bones. And that protects us. The same is psychologically. You build a wall and you fortify it because there's a siege. And if that siege continues to put pressure, it will ultimately breach the wall. And a spiritual infection will enter. And that can lead to the final stage of Tisha B'Av. So Asar B'Tevis we honor today, thousands of years later, because we have this challenge today to fortify our walls. Fortify our walls means that we live in a world around us and we interact, people go to work, there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to have times when you have that concentration, that focus, where nothing enters. Not internet, and not anything, any information, but you're able to focus, what we call that silent space. That people talk about when they meditate, going into yourself, being able to surround yourself by a certain, like an oasis, by walls. And there are times when you have to be inside there, and then when you have that strength, then you could go outside the walls, and know how to interact with the world around you without being overwhelmed by it. And that becomes the root of all the challenges. So fortifying the wall is the key to preventive medicine, to preventing the breach and the burning down or the destruction. And not fortifying the wall, God forbid, is also the opening of leading to a breach and a rupture and fragmentation and all the forces that split us into parts and ultimately hurt us and even cause damage. And that's why Asar B'Tevis is honored. It's the celebration, in a way. Not a celebrating day, it's a celebration, but it's a sense of awe and sanctity to respect the day that teaches us the importance of fortifying our fortifications, fortifying our walls, fortifying that you have an inner self that should not be violated, not by you and not by anyone else. And that inner self should be saved and preserved for people you love, for spiritual experiences, for truth, for reality. So yes, we are sent to an earth, to a cruel life and a fragmented world in order to bring light to it. But the first thing is you have to have a sense of self. You have to have a confidence within you. Then you can go to war. Then you can battle the forces around you. Then you can illuminate the world around you. But the first thing is to have that space inside of you that you don't let the outside world invade or violate. And this is something that every person can do. You can do it in the morning when you wake up and you say Moda'ani. When you do it through prayer, before you enter into the real so-called material world, you create space. You do it through study, through reading something. You do it before you go to sleep instead of having the television on or falling asleep with a newspaper on your nose. Read something that is soulful. A poem, a book, a prayer, something spiritual, whatever it is that speaks to your inner place. If people wonder, how do I find love in my life? And how do I find healthy, enduring relationships? Relationship is an inner experience. Relationship is not an outer one. If your life is inundated and besieged and even breached, or worse, it's going to affect how you love. It's going to affect how much time you have to focus on it. How to love in a selfless way. People love, but they love in a way that's also part of their own survival. So their loving is about taking. It's about needs. It's an inner experience. Love is supposed to be an inner experience, but it's playing by the rules of the outer world, which is about aggression, and about conquest, and about hunting, and about acquisition, acquiring. Real love emerges. Real love is about listening more than about talking. Real love is about giving more than taking. And that's an inner experience, but it's been contaminated. Relationships have become affected because we live in a rat race, and the relationships, we also live in that instant gratification world. There's all these new rules, so much focus on the material, the technique of love, instead of the intimacy of it. Intimacy is what goes on behind the closed walls. And that's the challenge. So when you're dealing with someone who's trying to heal or trying to grow, you want to work on what's going on inside your walls. And trying to clear up, get rid of the clutter, get rid of the besieging. There's plenty of battles to be fought, but they should be fought outside your walls, not inside. And the breaches come as a result of the siege. So the first step of all is preventing the siege from taking over your life. And that means, yes, clearing your mind and your heart. And takes work and effort, because we are addicted and to our habits. We're addicted to our gadgets, and beyond. Nobody would want to be under a microscope of how many times a day you check your texts or emails and so on. But we see it almost as emancipation. What do you mean? I can check my email anytime. Kind of freedom that is. But is it freedom? Can you also talk to someone you love while you're checking it? And I told you the story. I was in a car with someone, trying to get his attention for half an hour. He won't, ignoring me. So I finally texted him. And he says to me, "Why are you texting me? You're sitting right near me." Yeah. You understand what's going on. So we live in a world like gadgets. The classic story of the professor who got too busy to give his class to his students. So he came up with a great idea. Instead of going to give a class, he just recorded it on a machine, on what we would call today an iPod. And he had a secretary place it on the desk, and the students were expected to listen to this recording and take notes. I guess this was before video classes. Anyway, a few months pass, and the professor one day does come to university. Decides he's going to peek into the classroom, see how his great innovation is working. And lo and behold, he peeks into the door and he sees, wow, amazing. There's no one in the classroom. Instead, there are a bunch of tape recorders on each desk in the record mode. Their machine, his machine is speaking to their machine. They learn, this is called teaching by example. They learn from him. They're also too busy. So each one leaves their tape recorder, then they come and they pick it up and they listen to it in their good time. So I use technology, and I don't see it as an evil, and I see it as an opportunity. But I sometimes wonder how much of a slave we've become. And most importantly, as I said, it's so subliminal, because it makes you think you're in power. You can contact anyone, anywhere, anytime, any information, every second. But the real test is how it affects our relationships with people, our children, how much time we're really giving them. Are you able to focus on something without any external stuff around? And unfortunately, because we live in a time of comfort and a time of prosperity, with all the recessions, it's still a relatively comfortable world that we live in, high standard of living. We don't notice the siege, because it's not like the Nazis or the communists or the pogroms or the Cossacks or the Crusaders attacking. It's all so subtle. And as a matter of fact, it's in the name of emancipation, as I said, in the name of freedom. We don't notice it until, unfortunately, when things turn bad and there's a crisis, then suddenly, person sitting Shiva, for example, Most people are not interested in text messages then. Maybe someone sends them a message of consolation. Suddenly the things that are so important when there's a crisis, suddenly realize how little important they are. I'm not suggesting again that anyone should have a crisis ever. God forbid. It's just to study human nature to see how things are. When things are in years of plenty, we don't prepare for years of famine. That's why Joseph was so successful and so brilliant, because he was able to actually implement it, not just think about it. So we all have the siege, and there are many, many forms and shapes it takes. And the first step is you got to create that space. Maybe that's why Shabbos is such a powerful day, a real Shabbos, where you are with your family. There's no room for any distractions. There's no room for technologies, all their gifts. This is an internal day. And you sing a song with your family, and you celebrate. And don't do it mechanically. Do it like real. Cherish a day where you can shut everything off as much as possible. And you look at almost every mitzvah has that same type of oasis type of personality. It's about shutting things down and letting the experience emerge. We all have it. For example, you go out to nature, you can suddenly just stop and watch a flower, watch an animal, watch a tree, and you see beauty. And that part has definitely become compromised. As the Thoreau writes, that most men lead lives of quiet desperation. I don't know if he meant men and not women, but that's what he writes. And they die with their song still inside them. That's the most depressing part. They die with their song still inside them. Because there's a song in the soul that wants to emerge. Unfortunately, it has to contend with very serious competition. All kinds of things that are attracting us. And the first step in any healing is creating that space. And it's much easier to do when there's no crisis, because then you have the ability, the presence of mind. And I tell the story about this guy, small shtetl went to visit Vilna. Was a big city. And he comes back to his little shtetl, he says, "It's amazing what I see there." I say, What? Tell us. He says, "This is a Jew that is a believer, an atheist. There's a person who argues with everybody, a person who gets along with everybody. There's a scholar, there's a guy who prays, there's a guy who denies, there's a guy, there's a cynic, there's a realist. It's unbelievable." So they say, I don't understand, why is Vilna unique? I mean, everywhere you have such diversity. He says, no, it's all one person. It's all the same person. That's what he discovered. It's all the same Jew. The moment he's a believer, then he's an atheist, he's a this, he's a that. We have many, many voices and fragments inside of us. And it has an impact on us. The key challenge is to be able to find that seamless thread that connects it all, and that requires going deeper inside who you are, discovering your calling, your mission, the thing that overrides all the details. Everyone has something of that nature. So I encourage you for sure to use a day like tonight and tomorrow, a good opportunity to think about the walls, and before they're breached, to think about the siege and what you can do about it. And there's plenty you can do. I remember, I think I shared this, I was once preparing for a weekend retreat with my brother, and he came to my office, but he came with his newborn, well, he wasn't so newborn, his 9 or 10-month-old kid, son. And my office is like a mecca for children because there's a lot of paper there. And this child is especially wild, made sure to make a real mess of the whole place. Paper was everywhere. I came to a point of recognizing that children don't appreciate the brilliance of all these papers and so on. And the truth is, I actually was welcoming it because of an opportunity to throw out half of the garbage I had collected. But this child was making what a mess, and it was actually nice. I love when children make a mess, to be very honest. It reminds me of the Medrash. There's a Medrash on the verse in Shir HaShirim, I think. Dilugi alai ava, it says. And love jumped up on me. Consume me. So the Medrash says, Dilugi alai ava is God speaking about children. Now when children take, let's say, books, holy books, or even a Torah scroll, and they throw it on the ground, and playfully, they don't know what they're doing. And they jump on it, because children like to jump on things. So God says, jump on me with love. Diluge elayava. Jump on me with love, because he feels the love of children. So children have an innocence, even when they may be doing something. And I'd rather the innocence of a child that's doing some damage than the so-called adults that are not. Let's put it that way. I don't mean real damage, obviously. But anyway, this child was going all over the place, and my brother kept on running after him. And then I don't know why, but I turned on the monitor, the television in the office. I had a big monitor up there. And suddenly, literally, this child, after the last half hour, was this like restless, could not sit in one place child with all this animated energy, suddenly froze and was staring at the screen, and it was like chilling to see. So chilling that like after 20 seconds, my brother says, "Shut it off." And I shut it off. And the child stayed another 10 seconds watching, waiting for something, just looking at the screen. And it was interesting to me, because the child, I guess, never had seen a screen before. And I realized, what happened? Why did he suddenly freeze? Stop moving about. And I think that this was 20 seconds. Imagine if it was 20 minutes, 20 hours, 20 years. What does it do to our spirit? Like the guy that says to this, he says, "I'm into sports." He says, "Really? What do you play?" He says, "I watch football every Sunday." What do they say about baseball? I know it's not the baseball season now. The Super Bowl coming. Playoffs first. I'm aware of some things going outside the walls. So they say in baseball there's 70,000 people who need exercise watching 18 people who don't. So we live in a world of visualization where we are hypnotized by images. And it's very powerful. Good images can change your life. But they also they can numb you. And what kind of damage is done of that to the psyche? No studies have been made. I mean, recently I saw a recommendation from the Board of Education somewhere to minimize the watching of television until you're age 4 or 5. Okay. But what damage does it do? The problem is it's not physical damage. You understand? It's not damage you can point to. But what does it do to the spirit? What would be a child had study a child that was not exposed to any outer stimulation? All stimulation came from human beings. No images, no sounds even. Natural sounds. But definitely not an overabundance, an overwhelming amount of menu of all these stimulation. So I'll leave these things for you all to think about. And above all, as I said, as we enter into this Asar B'Tevis, every day has its power. The power of thinking about what you have inside your walls, what belongs outside the walls, and fortifying them. And realizing that the most real things in life, real love, the real intimacy, happen inside, deep inside. And you need to give it time and space and not allow other things to occupy that place. I know they occupy Wall Street, but maybe it's time to occupy our souls, or let our souls occupy us, maybe better put. So here's a toast to our souls, to each of your souls, which remains waiting, beckoning, yearning, and it's up to us to shut down some of the sounds or some of the stimulation to allow the soul to speak to you. And you'd be surprised how in direct proportion to shutting down the extracurricular sounds, how new voices and new melodies will emerge from within you. And that's my blessing to you on this Asar B'Tevis, this 10th of Tevis. So may everybody not wait, but actually discover the song within you and allow it to sing, because not only is it necessary for your own self-actualization and for your own fulfillment, but it's also necessary for the entire world, because if you don't sing your song, other songs also are not complete. And that's how it begins. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But then comes the second step, which is if I'm only for myself, what am I? We all are in need of each other. So there's the inner you that needs to speak, and one that's not influenced by peer pressure, social pressure, parental pressure, religious pressure, but it's you, your voice. And then that voice, the stronger it is, the more power it has to touch and influence others. And as the Kotzker Rebbe once said about relationships, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am not and you are not. But if I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, I am and you are. If you didn't get the poetic version, simple English, it means that if my identity is defined by you, and your identity is defined by me, I will not be complete. I will not be, period, and you will not be. I'll be constantly blind leading the blind. I'll be shaped by you, you'll be shaped by me, which means no one's shaping anybody. But if I am I because I'm I, if I have an identity that comes from within my inner walls, and is strong and fortified, and you are you because you are you, then you have two circles and they can really join. And but if you don't have the two complete circles, that sense of inner self becomes very difficult. Someone else is going to find it for you. Someone else can provide it for you. So here's to you are you and I am I, and then we can join together. It's always an honor to speak to all of you and to share this intersection of our soul's journey. I will say that tomorrow night Philip will be giving his regular class 7 p.m. He let me know. Anyone interested, just contact us at the office. Spiritual Creativity, it's called. And another announcement is, in case you have not left your email address with us, please do so. So we can send a message from behind the walls to outside the walls. And to stay in touch any way that I and the Meaningful Life Center can be of assistance, please by all means call upon me, call upon us as time allows, but that's what we're here for. And with that being said, everyone have a very pleasant week. I look forward to see you next Wednesday. Thank you.